Let's talk a bit about the state of the luxury watch market. And I'm going to be looking at this from the perspective of someone who is in the finance industry, both an investor but also a finance professor. I'm going to go through some comments I made to Business Insider, but also my general perspective about luxury watch prices and the nature of the market. Now, my name's Mark. Welcome back to the channel. If you have any thoughts about luxury watches, about the market, or about the price that some of these watches are commanding, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's take a step back and think about what's happening to luxury watch prices. Luxury watch prices, anecdotally, are extremely high, particularly in the secondary market. Many of us have come across issues getting access to many watches, Rolexes, Audemars Piguet, other highly in demand watches from boutiques. Oftentimes they're not even in stock. Oftentimes then, one will either need to try to get onto a waiting list, maybe by accruing a purchase history or whatever, or going into the secondary market, where you'll typically have to pay rather a high amount above retail, depending on exactly which watch you're looking at. If you're looking for a Rolex Submariner, then it will often be quite a bit above retail. If it's just an ordinary Oyster Perpetual, then maybe it will have depreciated. Regardless, luxury watch prices are strong in the secondary market. This is sometimes decried. Sometimes people look at this and think that it's unfair, or blame watch flippers, or blame authorized dealers for giving allocations to their preferred clients. Whatever the case might be, people sometimes look at this as a negative. So let's have a look at what Business Insider was reporting about this. And I won't go through the whole thing, but I'll go through some of the pertinent points. And then I'll give you my thoughts about why it is that strong secondary market is actually a good thing if you're looking to buy a watch and if you actually care about not losing money, which, from the perspective of someone in finance, is primarily what I personally am concerned about. So let's have a look at this Business Insider article. So here we have an article by David Adams in, like I said, Business Insider. The title of it is Inside Australia's Booming Luxury Watch Market, where buyers will pay thousands above retail price, and a steel Rolex is as good as gold. So that's kind of setting the scene for what the article is going to be about. So the key points in the article. The luxury watch market has exploded in 2021, driving prices for brands like Rolex into the stratosphere. But empty storefronts and rampant speculation, it's never been harder to buy some watches at retail. Dealers, enthusiasts, and first-time buyers say some luxury watches are becoming their own asset class. So that's effectively what they are saying as their key points. Then they litter the article with anecdotes, some of which are interesting, but maybe are not really telling us terribly much. To give you one example, it took a year, $26,000, and a round flight around the world, the Adelaide businesswoman Gigi Fab, to find her bluesy. I assume this is referring to the Rolex bluesy. I'm not quite sure why it was costing her $26,000, but anyway. The chase took her across Europe and Asia, and as far as the Bahamas. But every overseas trip ended in disappointment. Each new lead came up cold. The hunt was nerve-wracking, she admitted. Her quest would not end in Paris, Hong Kong, or the sun-kissed Caribbean. Instead, Fab would find Bluesy, a new steel and gold Rolex Submariner watch, sporting a royal blue dial far closer to home. More specifically, she would find it in the hands of Sydney aftermarket dealer asking $6,000 more than the retail price. Maybe she could have looked at Chrono24 to be able to look up watches, or any number of other watch marketplaces, because they exist on Facebook, online, whatever. I am not quite sure why we had this round-the-world trip to get a watch. Cornered by pandemic travel restrictions and exhausted by barren Rolex boutiques worldwide, Fab surrendered to paying the grey market premium. I'm one of the lucky ones, she told me. Now, I won't continue on with that anecdote, but the pertinent point that they really are emphasizing here is, if you walked into a Rolex dealer today with enough money to buy one of the more popular models, you'd probably walk out empty-handed. Across Australia and the world, the brand's glittering boutiques sit almost empty. Prospective buyers say that the best staff can offer is to put them on their waiting list, with first-time buyers lucky to wait 18 months on standby. One retailer told Fab the wait for a new bluesy Submariner would take 5 years. This is not to say you can't buy a new Rolex, it's just unlikely that you will find one in an authorized dealer. Now, this largely sets the scene for much of what the article says. It is very difficult to buy many watches from Rolex and other brand name watch dealerships. This is not surprising. Many of us who are kind of interested in watches are quite familiar with this. There are several questions, however, that are more important. Firstly, why is this the case? Secondly, is this bad? In terms of the first question, why is this the case? Well, there's probably a few answers to this. One of these is that there are just supply issues. It's difficult for watch manufacturers, when they are hand-making watches, which exist at the higher end, to keep up with demand. And demand has increased. Demand has increased in part due to people getting more money from other asset classes. So, for example, and this is a very twee example, but say, for example, someone made a lot of money on Bitcoin, they want to do something with the money, they put it into watches. A probably more common one is there's been a lot of inflation in cars and in houses. So if someone made money on a car or a house, they sell those and then they decide to go out and buy a watch. And this is happening quite frequently. So, for example, in the United States, in the most recent inflation data, used cars were up 31% year on year. That's staggering. And if it's the type of person who has a luxury car, or more likely a supercar that's experienced the high inflation, then that person will have a decent amount of cash to go out and spend. This soaks up all of the supply. So when you're seeing the other asset classes seeing inflation, people have money to spend on things like Rolexes. Interest rates are also very low, so they are less beholden to high interest rates on home loans. Furthermore, when you've got the inflation, you've got the home loans and the low interest rates on those, then you also have the fact that every other asset class has become expensive, ranging from crypto, although that's super volatile, through to stocks, through to real estate. Everything's become expensive. So if someone is thinking, well, those things look overpriced, I just want to park my money somewhere, buy something I'll enjoy, I'll go into a watch. And this creates the demand for watches, which is going to soak up a lot of the supply. To my mind, supply and demand influences things significantly. Rolex is also specifically stated as such. So, for example, in the article, they state, and this is correct, Rolex says the watch shortages are primarily due to supply chain issues. In a rare public statement in September, Rolex claimed to be afflicted by the same restrictions facing other advanced manufacturers around the world. The scarcity of its models was not a strategy on our part, the brand said, dismissing speculation it had deliberately restricted output to capitalize on demand. Third-party analysis backs up this claim. Rolex, notoriously secretive about its production output, is thought to manufacture around 1 million watches in a normal year. However, a Morgan Stanley report suggests the number was close to 800,000 in 2020, after COVID-19 restrictions severely hit several of its production sites. Subsequently, Rolex North America told the watch production Hodinkee that it would not churn out extra pieces to make up the deficit, saying, "We're never going to compromise the quality of our product." So clearly there's a supply issue due to COVID and lag. There's the increase in demand that I already remarked about, which is to some extent driving the prices. You, in addition to this, have some unscrupulous ADs, authorized dealers. There are some authorized dealers who will intentionally sell it to their friends, who will then go and flip it in the grey market, and they might split some of the profit. That's generally frowned upon, and Rolex is generally going to ban an authorized dealer that does this. It's not something the brand necessarily wants done, and it is something that not all authorized dealers do. There are some bad apples, but it is very important to not tar all of the authorized dealers with the same brush, i.e., not all of them have done the same bad practices. And I think it is unfair to blame them for this. When we're seeing production issues, so a reduction in supply, an increase in demand, that could easily explain what is happening with a bit of a bubble here. And like I said, that increase in demand is in part stemming from the inflation in other asset classes, which either makes them appear to be overpriced, or B, gives people access to money they can spend on watches. So that's the first part of it. why is it that prices are reasonably high? To my mind, a lot of it is due to supply and demand dynamics, with some of it being behavioral in nature, i.e., everything becoming overpriced, and then people kind of shifting into watches as a result. So watches are legitimately an asset class if we're looking at things like Rolexes or Audemars Piguet or Patek or Vacheron, for example, as just as some examples of asset class type watches. The next question is this a bad thing? And here I'll go to one quote in this article to illustrate why I don't think the strong secondary market is a bad thing. So this, I think, neatly illustrates it. I think it's perfectly fine that they're heading into the asset class territory. It's about time Rolex watches severed the last dwindling ties to practicality and instead became simple stores of wealth. Basically, there are two things that one can have. You can either have a cheap and readily available watch, or you can have a watch that holds its value. And getting both of them isn't really going to work. So to my mind, you effectively are, by having watches become a bit of an asset here, enabling them to be a store of value. This means you can go out and buy a Rolex, enjoy it for a little while, then sell it, and not get taken to the cleaners on the amount of money that you have lost. This means you can continue to enjoy watches for a longer period of time. To my mind, it's actually a feature, not a bug, that there is a strong secondary market. And this, I think, is important. In every market where there is a strong secondary market, it helps to prop up the primary market, because then people are more confident to go out and buy it from the primary market, knowing they're not going to be taken apart when they go to sell their watch. I don't see there being any inherent good in watches losing value. I don't see there being any inherent good in people having to lose money to enjoy watches. Why is it that you should lose money to enjoy watches? Why is that a good thing? I don't understand why it is that people want others to lose money when they are buying watches. It makes no sense. To my mind, it's a little bit like tall poppy syndrome or jealousy, in that people are effectively wanting other people to lose money, which is poor form, in my opinion. So I think there's an inherent bonus to having a strong secondary market. This is even the case if it makes it a little bit more difficult to get things in the primary market. If you have to wait 6 months or a year to get something, it is still better to have to wait that time and get something that won't lose value than to buy something right now and see it tank. And to be clear here, if you can go out and buy a new watch very easily, they will not hold value because people will just go to the primary market. By the primary market being a little bit more restricted, that helps the secondary market and helps the value retention there. If you just have untrammeled supply, the prices won't hold up in the secondary market. So it is important that there are the strong prices here. I think there's also a solid sustainability story as well. Because if watches are simply a commodity that you can buy and then throw out, then if that's simply the case, then they just become disposable. We end up with more clutter. We end up with less sustainability in the luxury market. This flies in the face of the current trend toward a circular economy. The circular economy trend is trying to make sure that people can recycle, reuse, or sell luxury and other fashion items. That includes watches, and core to that circular economy is being able to sell your asset for a reasonable price, to make it worth your time going out and selling it, but also to make it worthwhile having that secondary market. Because without decent prices, you won't get that secondary market. So that's why I actually don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that these prices have held up. Watches absolutely have become an asset class, at least at the moment. We can argue about whether they are slightly inflated. We can argue about whether they will go back down in price. But I don't think it is the end of the world in terms of watch prices being reasonably strong. Now, the next question is, might these watches go back down in price? Are we in a temporary blip? Well, that's crystal ball gazing, but like I said, inflation is super high. The most recent inflation figures put us at 6.8% inflation in the United States. Used cars were up 31% year on year. That's insane. Now, core CPI was, granted, lower than 6.8%. But when you're seeing everything else inflate by that amount of money, then it is going to put price pressure on watches. That price pressure, however, is likely to attenuate as other sources of inflation taper back down. To be clear here, inflation is not transient, it's not just going to turn off, but it will trend back down toward normalcy. And as that's occurring, we're likely to see watch prices also take a little bit of a hit. They're not going to stay at this price forever, but it's going to remain reasonably strong, but not going to be able to maintain the strong level of growth that it has seen. Because, like I said, a lot of it is propped up by other asset classes increasing in price, shifting money into watches, in my opinion. So I think it will become weaker in the future, or become weaker as supply picks back up, or become weaker as demand goes back down, or become weaker as people can spend their money on other things, or spend their money on holidays, because with COVID, people haven't been able to spend their money on holidays, so as soon as they start spending a couple of thousand on a holiday, all of a sudden they're less able to afford a watch. So you're going to see some demand reduce. In any case, those are my thoughts on it. I hope it's been informative to you. If you have any thoughts about the watch market, I'd be interested to hear those in the comments below. And otherwise, it would be great if you liked the video and subscribe to the channel. And hopefully I will see you for future videos as well.